All right, so then we're talking about this book chapter called No Easy Place or Time from a book entitled Making Whiteness. Making Whiteness. So, although you could think of this chapter as a chapter about blackness, you should also read between the lines for what you can draw out about whiteness. Okay? And the construction of whiteness and the construction of blackness as far as that goes. I would remind you, of course, that this course builds upon itself. You should have already looked at the videos on Reconstruction and so forth. You should be very familiar with what happened, at least during Reconstruction. But this reading actually takes us well into the 1920s, which is, 35 years after Reconstruction. So it does take us into historical territory about which you may not be, at this point anyway, as informed as you might want to be. But I think that, you guys are smart enough and hardworking enough. You understand what Wikipedia is, and if you need to check a few things out from time to time, you certainly can. And indeed, maybe you should, as far as that goes. All right? So we're going to start with question number 1. Explain what is meant by necessary space in the first section of this chapter. In what ways did blacks fill this necessary space? In what ways did whites fill this necessary space? And why is this notion important? All right? So let me see here. I'll try to work on the names, but we'll just, let me see. I'm not going to be able to do that. Go ahead. Tell us what the necessary space is. By the way, let me just add, you have permission to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure. Okay? All right, my friend. What's your first name?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, okay. Just tell us what the necessary space is in your opinion.
The African Americans filled it by creating slave culture. So
what is it? What is the necessary space? Yeah, they filled it, but what is it? Yeah, I'll hold it.
Okay. All right, I would like to stand up.
Don't touch my mic, man.
No.
Okay.
I'm gonna stand up too.
Okay.
The necessary space, in my opinion, is that it's more like a personal territory. I believe that it's like
or a distance.
Well, not distance, but like a territory, more like your individual circle. Or your community, inner self circle. So that's what I think, and that's what my opinion is.
Okay, and let me ask you a follow-up. This is necessary space. Well, first of all, this space exists in relationship to whom else?
It also relates to any other kind of people. It also relates to white and also African American. It's more like a hobby based, or more like a principle based beyond their inner self. So that's what I believe, and that's what I'm getting at so far from.
Okay, all right. That's good. That's good. Add more about this necessary space. I think we've missed a few things. Tell us more.
I don't know.
Okay, tell us more.
I don't know.
You don't know. All right. Tell us more.
I really don't know.
You don't know? Tell us more. Tell us more about this necessary space. What makes it necessary? Why is it necessary?
I feel like white people that owned slaves just didn't have them anymore, so they noticed that there was an absence between there, and they started giving up their land to the black people once they started talking about the Civil War, as I recall when I was reading. And I just feel like they saw that necessity of depending on someone to keep their land running and keep their life going, because they started losing what they had, and they never valued slaves like they should have, but they did start valuing them in another type of way once they saw that they did not have their presence anymore.
Well, let me ask you this. Did this space, this necessary space, as you say, between blacks and whites, in the context of this article, we're talking about necessary space between blacks and whites. In the entire story, both during slavery and after slavery, was there always this necessary space?
I don't know.
You don't know? Was there always this necessary space?
I feel like the necessary space came more or less after they were freed, because they, like I mentioned earlier, they weren't giving their freedom once they were slaves. They were treated like slaves, and after, whites saw that they needed, like I mentioned earlier, they depended on someone. So it was the need that they wanted people to still work for them.
Okay. So you're saying that the necessary space existed only after slavery. Did it exist during slavery?
It existed, but it wasn't noticed. I feel like they were trying to hide the fact that, it's not going to be hidden. Slavery was there, but they obviously didn't recognize a person that they should have recognized until they noticed that, oh, they're not going to work for me anymore, or perhaps I've lost land because, no one's willing to do the work anymore. No one wants to be treated like crap anymore. People want their freedom. People want their rights. And I feel like it was only after that, it was there, but it was only after that it was noticed by those owners.
Okay. All right. So she acknowledges that this necessary space did exist during slavery and after slavery. Briefly, what did this necessary? I'm still kind of unsatisfied with your answer about what the necessary space is. Help us out here. We're missing something. What is the necessary space? Be even more precise.
I'm not sure.
Okay. How about you?
I'm not sure.
How about you?
I don't know.
How about you?
I would say it's the separation of slaves and their owners.
Okay, so it's the social space, if you will. It's the space between a black person and a white person, between a slave or a freed person after slavery, and either his owner during slavery or his former owner after slavery, or in more broad terms, between, shall we say, blacks and whites generally, right? Okay. So notice that this is space that's necessary. It's necessary to survive. And it is a space that is filled with something. What is it filled with? Generally, what is it filled with? What is it filled with? What is it filled with?
I don't know.
Okay, what is it filled with? What is it filled with?
I would say it's filled with the space. But
No, it's space that's got to be filled with something. Space can't be filled with space.
From the blacks, what they would bring like music and religion and their own beliefs about things.
Okay, so blacks under slavery kind of built their own culture carefully, but filled the space, as you say, with religion, with notions of themselves, with music, right? They filled the space, right? Okay. So the space is filled with cultural... Excuse me. Only one person gets to talk at a time. Okay? Do you guys have something you want to add? That's fine. Do you have something?
Well, I was wondering if you were kind of looking for where it says in the passage that the necessary space was kind of like from preventing legal slavery from becoming spiritual slavery.
Right. So, during slavery... Oh, go ahead. Say more about that. So, during slavery, think about this for a minute. Slaves were slaves, right? They were slaves. They were legally slaves. They were treated as slaves. And by the way, to be treated as slave means to be treated as... What? As what?
A property?
As property or less than human, right? Okay, so these slaves legally were property, and in a sense, well, in a lot of senses, they were less than human. For instance, they didn't have civil rights. They didn't own themselves, right?
They were also counted as 1/3.
Well, that's right. So in that sense, they were less than human beings, right?
Yeah.
Okay. 2/3, by the way. But anyway, that's okay. I get what you're saying. So the point is that you were trying to make is that they wanted to make sure that this legal slavery did not become spiritual slavery. So they asserted themselves, the way these ladies said over there, by creating culture, By the way, hiding it frequently from their slave masters, doing it in private, right? But they also did something with reference to their other behaviors. What did they do? While they were working, for instance. What? Huh? What?
They became literate?
Well, yeah, some of them became literate, and they wanted to become literate desperately, but while they were working, for instance, they would, how shall I say this, fill this space, this necessary space, with certain behaviors. Pardon? You said education? No?
I didn't say that. Heaven did.
Okay. Yuna? What did they fill it with?
Communication.
Communication. Okay. Well, that's not exactly what I was after.
I think I have it.
Okay, Heaven?
Okay, I think that with African Americans, they filled it with education and mobility. So basically,
Wait. Not during slavery.
not during slavery.
Not during slavery.
Okay, well, like
There was no social mobility to be had for a slave under slavery.
But like they okay, whenever like say if they were on the job and then they heard like someone else having the teaching, they would kind of like catch on to it. So whenever the slavery was abolished, or not abolished, but like they would create their own schools, create their own churches, make their own culture. So therefore the whites couldn't even like interfere with that. But the whites were still scared, so that's why they made segregation. But not giving them any of the benefits that the whites actually had.
Okay, I like the way you maneuvered out of that. That's really good. You showed me that you understand the concept of necessary space, and you showed us all that sometimes you're right. They did fill it with education in private, so that if ever, a miracle would happen and they found themselves free, then of course they could, shall we say, grow, right? Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that during slavery, blacks filled this necessary space with behaviors, building their own culture, separate and apart from the culture that their slave owners would want them to have, right? Okay. You have your hand up over here?
Well, the question I was answering, it says, they filled it with loyalty and laziness to play their owners' fantasies and desires, while securing very material benefits like more food, more movement, and less work and control in return.
Right. Notice this. They would act subservient, right? Go ahead.
I was just giving
They would act subservient because they knew they had to be. They would act lazy. They would play along with the idea that the slave master had about them as people, right? Okay. So another way of thinking about this is that this necessary space is filled with representations. In other words, during slavery and after slavery, blacks had a certain view of themselves, and whites had a certain view of blacks, right? And so this necessary space becomes filled with representations. All right? So, in what ways did whites fill this representational space, either during slavery or after? Oh, I thought you were going to...
They just wanted to feel more powerful, so they would just not let them have, like, the resources that they needed. So I don't know how to word it. Just skip me. I don't want to.
Okay. Let me go ahead and read from my notes. We're kind of dragging on this question, but let me just kind of flesh this out. Both during slavery and after slavery, blacks carved out this necessary space. But remember, after slavery, when they become free, they don't have to carve out the space anymore. They've been given the space, right? Now they have to fill it with something. And as you said, during slavery, they wanted to make sure that slavery didn't become spiritual slavery, so they asserted themselves, right? Now, what whites did is they filled this space with representations. Okay? So as far as that goes, they would see blacks as lazy, as stupid, as dirty, as subhuman, right? And this is how they saw them. And so what blacks would do, both during slavery and after slavery, by the way, when I say blacks would do this, I don't mean all blacks would do this. That's not what I'm saying. And they might do it differently. But what they would do is they would kind of act in ways that they knew whites perceived them as. This is the so-called darky act, right? They would act in ways that whites perceived them as, although they weren't really that way, okay? And so to get back to your answer, this space is space that's necessary, right? It's space that's needed to be a full human being. But when you are a slave, as you said, you are property. You do not have a self, right? I mean, in constitutional terms, you don't have a self. You don't have civil rights. You can't vote, right? But after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, you actually are given civil rights. You become constitutionally a self, a full person, right? So this is very important. And blacks, of course, like anybody else, would want to exercise their selfhood. And so, after slavery, then they got educated, they tried to get educated, they became business owners, they became farmers. Frequently, they made sure that the distance between themselves and their former owners was greater. I mean, literally, on my lecture, I showed you how when they had the chance, they moved their houses away from further and further away from the master, even if they continued to work for him on his land after slavery was done away with. They made sure they had space, right? But what this reading is about, it's about how the representations of blacks impacted their lives. Okay? And I would argue that this is a process that continues to happen. Okay? So, to use a contemporary example I might have used the other day, when your president speaks of Mexicans as being rapists and criminals, that is a representation. You are being presented as a rapist and a criminal. It's a representation. I would argue, by the way, that that is essentially a white supremacist representation. So in that sense, there's necessary space between Latinos or Mexicans and white folks in this country. And some white people are filling that space with a representation like I just mentioned. And that's exactly what whites in the post-bellum or the post-Civil War period did with blacks. So that this article is about representations of who these people are and who they would like to be. But also, notice, it's about the limitations that those representations put on people. Okay? So, just to use the example I just cited, and then I'll get to you, I would imagine that for some Mexicans, when they hear what President Trump says, it affects their behavior. It affects the way they are going to carry themselves. Right? And so that's the same thing that we have going on here with blacks and whites.
So basically, bottom line is that it's basically labeling.
Well, it is labeling, but I don't want it. But I don't want you to go to the sticks and stones may break my bones thing. I want to go to the point where representations are actually power. Right? Where representations have an impact. Brian, did you have your hand up a minute ago?
Yeah, but it's kind of confusing for a second.
Okay, all right. And so we read about masks that these black people wore. We read about the so-called Darky Act, where blacks in order to, shall we say, get along after slavery, would kind of act like they thought they were supposed to act, especially earlier, act stupid, act lazy, when in fact they may not have been that at all. But in order to get by, in order to survive, that's what they had to do. So what I want you to see is that the space was necessary for their very survival. And the more space they got after the Civil War, the more they exercised their freedom, the more they became, shall we say, selves, right? They became selves, they exercised their freedom, but as some of you have implied, they also ran up against a new social system that we would call segregation, okay? So this is necessary space, essential to survival, that can either block or open movement. All right? Does that make sense enough? We'll move on to number 2, but anybody else have anything else they want to say about that? By the way, you all exercise similar space between you and me. I'm not sure how it works, but as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking this is how it works. I'm the professor, you're the student, and you guys have to live with my representations of you. You have to live with, the distance between us. Literally, if I get too close, you feel like, wait, I need some space here, right? Well, if you've experienced that, then that's a good thing. Anything else on question number 1? Blacks filled the necessary space with both acting like they were supposed to, but also increasingly being, shall we say, active in their own historical agency. Whites filled the space with different opinions, or as you said, what was the word you used? Labeling, but labels that had real cultural power. Okay? All right, question number 2. Come to you guys. What is meant by the double self? What is meant by the double self?
Basically, what we came up with is that blacks they had a past, but they didn't want to accept that as their identity.
Okay, they didn't want to. All right. All right. Help him out. They had an identity. They had a past, but they didn't want to accept that as their identity.
I don't know.
You're not sure? Okay.
They had their former slave self, but they also had their free self. So they didn't really like to talk about it, but they would still keep tradition by telling stories and singing songs.
Okay. All right. Alex, say more. Oops.
I put that the double self is meaning the slaves had 2 totally different lives. They remember the past but don't talk about it often until they are reminded by whites how illiterate they are. In the double self chapter, Hurston said he found self-consciousness about telling traditional tales and singing traditional songs for outsiders persisting into the 1930s.
Okay. All right. So occasionally you guys will hear me refer to myself as a 55-year-old white male, right? I'll be teaching away like, Professor Farrell does, and then I'll do something like, well, I'm a 55-year-old white male. What I'm doing really is I'm speaking of my own kind of double consciousness, which is to say I know I'm a professor, but I also know I'm a white male. A 55-year-old white male, which not an 18-year-old white male, but a 55-year-old white male. And along with those 2 labels come expectations, you might say. So this is self-consciousness. Self-consciousness. Now, the problem that I don't have, frankly, is I don't walk around in black or brown skin. And the meaning of white male, my culture, until recently, maybe, my culture for the most part hasn't had any trouble with white males. White males have been good, right? Now, of course, you see that with the talk about, Black Lives Matter and African history and what we're talking about today, you're starting to see white males very uncomfortable about being white males. And for that matter, white females being very uncomfortable about being white females, especially if they are, in addition to being white, they are affluent. Right? For all kinds of reasons. So this is self-consciousness, right? What Hale wants us to see is that African Americans were in a kind of double bind when it came to self-consciousness, right? On the one hand, they knew they were free. They knew they were, now had civil rights and could pursue their dreams. But they also had to do it in an emerging culture that increasingly, as Coates would say, told them they were a problem. They were a problem. So, as I said the other day, when Trump says Mexicans are rapists, he says to Mexicans, you are a problem. You're a problem. Now you have to carry that around with you, you see. In the case of African Americans, this double self was their own consciousness of, shall we say, being free now, but also, shall we say, being imposed upon. So Du Bois would speak of double consciousness. He said, always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. A two-ness, he said. You are an American and you are a Negro, in the words of Du Bois. You're two things, right? Well, the question is, once slaves become free, once they become human beings with civil rights, who are they? They would like to be Americans, equal with all of the rest of the Americans in every single way, but that's not how it worked out. They may have wanted to bust out of being a Negro, but of course they couldn't, because of reasons that we will both talk about and reasons that, we're aware of, right? And so this then is the double self. It's the double self-consciousness. And then when we jump ahead to the ladies' question, how does it get more complicated? Brian, how does it get more complicated when we jump ahead to number 5? We're not just talking about an American or a Negro. Once we get to black women, then we're talking about what else also?
Expectations that they see.
Precisely what expectation?
Only tending to the children and farming, pretty much.
Okay. Why would one only tend to the children and farming if one were a woman? Especially if, I don't know, she wanted to be a business person.
They believed that they weren't capable of becoming something better than that.
Okay. Or stated differently, a woman's place was in the home taking care of the children. Right. So notice then, what happens is that middle class respectability gets put on to black women, so that not only do they have to carry around this double self of, hey, I'm an American and a Negro, but I have to carry around, I'm an American, I'm a Negro, and I'm a woman. Right? The double self-consciousness the reading refers to as. Right? And you guys know what I'm talking about, because you come from homes where roles are defined by the culture of your family. And in some cultures, like mine, there is a very strong kind of motherly kind of thing going on, but my wife's a professional, and she's always been a professional, and her children have been raised in a house where a woman can be a professional, along with her husband being a professional, and, she's not restricted, shall we say, to taking care of the kids, doing the dishes, doing all of the shopping, and all of that stuff. Right? She and I have negotiated this over 37 years of marriage. She hasn't always felt comfortable about the way I want things. I haven't always felt comfortable the way that she wants things. But the point is, we've created a system whereby we conform to some kind of standard. Some of you come from cultures where, of course, that kind of thing ain't going to happen. Even if you get an education, you're going to still be a woman. And you're going to raise these damn kids, and I'm going to go out and earn the money, right? So the point here is that you have these very powerful representations of self, right? And they're very powerful, especially when we get to segregation, okay? So, I'll stay with you guys here and ask you question number 3. What explanation does the author offer for the creation of segregation and the New South? Why, in other words, did whites who emerged powerful, again, notice, they emerged powerful, again, in the New South, why did they systematize segregation? It's really a pretty simple answer.
I'm not sure.
You're not sure. Dejanique?
They basically encoded their essentialism into like the local states and laws.
Okay, you said they encoded their essentialism into the laws. What do you mean by that? That's right, by the way.
Oh, you want me to lean for it? I believe it means that basically they inserted like segregation into the laws, like stop blacks from doing like certain things.
Okay, so when you said essentialism, you meant what?
I don't know.
That's an important phrase. Do you guys, any of you guys know what essentialism is? What's essentialism? Heaven, do you know what essentialism is? What it refers to?
Essentialism?
Essentialism, in her answer. She said segregation was taking essentialism and putting it into law and practice. What is the essentialism she's talking about?
Because they already had the power. They had the power whenever they were slaves, and then whenever they gave them freedom, it's basically saying, like, just kidding, we take it back. But we're not, like, really, like, it's like secretly enforcing it kind of thing. Like, I don't know how to word it, but it's like,
okay,
not saying it, but being direct with your actions.
Okay, I like your answer, but I think you're a little bit off. What is the essentialism here?
Well, I think generally it's the principle of importantness.
Uh-huh.
Or I don't know.
And who's the most important?
The whites.
Whites, that's right. Go ahead.
I was just going to add on. I felt like the whites were offended when the blacks became equal to them. And so, well, not equal to them, but, just had civil rights and everything. So I think that's why they created the segregation, because they still felt to them personally that the blacks were inferior and that they were dirty. So they didn't want to involve themselves with dirty blacks who were inferior to them.
Okay. So to the question of what is essentialism, it means, in this argument, it means that whites are superior to blacks, period. Blacks are inferior, whites are superior. Essentialism is, Dejanique, essentialism is then white supremacy. Now, the answer to this question, of course, as you just said, is that the reason segregation emerged wasn't because blacks didn't do well, wasn't because they were stupid, it wasn't because they didn't work hard, it's actually because they started having success. They became a threat. They became, as you said, equal. And the myth that America engages in, the myth is that white supremacy is worst, is worst when whites see blacks as inferior. That's not what she's arguing. She's arguing white supremacy is worse when blacks gain success. So, when black players in the NFL take a knee during the national anthem in protest not of the American flag, but the fact that police officers around this country get to kill black people without having to answer for it, all too frequently, the President of the United States refers to them as sons of bitches and says they should be fired. By the way, athletes who make millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So Joe Sixpack, who works at the factory and who's white, stops watching the NFL. Why? Well, he's offended that these athletes, these celebrities who are making 5, 6, 10 times as much as he is, have the audacity to not do what they're supposed to do. Let me tell you something. When Trump referred to the NFL players as sons of bitches, he was saying, you uppity black folk need to learn how to behave. And the 30 to 35% of the population who agreed with it said the same thing. The problem isn't that they're not doing well. The problem is they're doing well. And they're doing better. Right? We could talk about Jay-Z. We could talk about Beyonce. We could talk about Kendrick Lamar. We could talk about a whole bunch of people. Right? And so segregation emerged and was systematized to encode, you said, Dejani, to encode essentialism in law. And then once it's law, what are you going to do about it? Especially when, for instance, in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, especially when the Supreme Court of the United States says this is law. Talk about encoding racism. Encoding essentialism. Hell yes. Right? That's exactly what was going on. Okay? All right. We've got 4 minutes left, huh? Damn. Question number 4. Quote from the book. If our commonality among African Americans must be blackness. And think about that for a minute. Couldn't their commonality be something else? It could be, right? In other words, if racism didn't exist, or it was done away with at the end of the Civil War, they wouldn't have had to be black people. Just like you wouldn't have to be brown people, I wouldn't have to be a white person, right? We'd just be Americans. And in some senses, that's kind of, how it works. We're just Americans. But in this country, we have these other distinctions as well. So the question becomes, if we are restricted and we must be black because they are white and because they make us black through their encoding of this essentialist racist notion, if I have to be black, what kind of black am I going to be? Now, Booker T. Washington comes along and says, I'm going to be an accommodationist black person. I'm going to get a technical education. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to make the white man happy. I'm going to act like a darky sometimes. I'm going to wear a mask. So, yes, sir. No, sir. I'm not going to push it too much. Right? That's one kind of blackness. By the way, that kind of blackness was around in slavery, and if you've ever read or will read Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom himself was the master martyr accommodationist in literary terms. If you are a black nationalist like Marcus Garvey and others, you say, no, we are Americans, we are worth something, but this country will not embrace us, so we need to go to Africa, and we need to, be the superior people in Africa. And if you're W.E.B. Du Bois, you stake out somewhere in between, called the muddled middle. Notice this, where you are both an American and you are black. Where you have to balance those things, where you have to be ambivalent. You have an ambivalent relationship socially, right? And the point that we're trying to make here isn't that those are the only 3 ways that black people could see themselves, but those are the 3 predominant ways that black people saw themselves. So to just jump ahead, one has to ask oneself, well, let's think about coats for a minute, by the way. The more I read this piece and the deeper I thought about it, the more I thought Coates has read Hale and he knows what she's saying. But one of the things that Coates the reason he's so problematic is because he's both saying that America is fundamentally racist, and he's saying you ought to treat me and people like me without seeing our color. Think about that. How can you do that? Talk about a double bind. Talk about a national double bind. How can you both, be an American or be colorless and be black at the same time? White folks all the time are saying, oh, these people of color, they drive me crazy. They're just engaged in identity politics. They just want brown and black and Asian. They're separating themselves from us. They're dividing America. Really? Who divided the South after the Civil War, after Reconstruction? Who divided the South? Who created blackness? I'll tell you, not blacks, whites did, because whites said, I am white and you're black, and that's essentially the way it is. That's essentialism. This is the argument here about how blackness is created, how whiteness is created. It's not just a representation. It's not just a label. It has power attached to it. Right? So let me tell you something. You may hate Trump, but he has power. You may hate Stephen Miller, his advisor, but he has power because they can do shit. They can do stuff to people. Right? We're not talking about something here that's just, supposition. This is real. And it translates into power. So, talk to blacks who lived in the South for 100 years after the Civil War. Talk to them about how race matters. Try to tell them that you're just making this stuff up. You want to be a person, just act like a person, right? To get back to my point I was going to make earlier, and then I'll let you go. I have never, nor will I ever, have to walk around in black skin or brown skin. And with all due respect, and I am not making light of anything, let me just say, I find myself thankful for that sometimes. I have advantages. It's called white privilege. One privilege is that when I'm driving down the street in my car with my music on loud, I'm not black. So what's the likelihood that I'm going to be pulled over? The answer is not nearly as likely as if I'm a black man driving in the same car with my music playing rap as loud as I possibly can. Follow me? So I want all of you to avoid the temptation that this stuff is somehow just academic, that it's not important, that it's not real. It's real. Follow me? Late! I think we busted it out!